Welcome back. And now for the news in detail. We start from the United Kingdom, which has warned Iran of serious consequences if it does not release a British oil tanker seized in the Gulf. Iran says it stopped the ship for not following international maritime regulations. Iran's military says the vessel turned off its tracker and ignored a guard's warnings. UK Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt says Tehran's actions are completely unacceptable and freedom of navigation must be maintained.
We're not looking at military options. We're looking at a diplomatic way to resolve the situation. But we are very clear that it must be resolved. Freedom of navigation in the Gulf is absolutely essential. If that freedom of navigation is restricted, Iran is the biggest loser.
Meanwhile, Tehran denied Washington's claim that it shot down an Iranian drone, saying all of its UAVs returned safely. Russian President Vladimir Putin expressed concern over the recent confrontation, saying it is happening near its country's borders. Now, moving on, meanwhile, Gibraltar's Supreme Court has extended the detention of an Iranian oil tanker until August the 15th. The announcement comes after the vessel's initial seizure order lapsed. Gibraltar's Attorney General Michael Lamar says the order followed a short hearing in front of Chief Justice Anthony Daly. Earlier, Gibraltar's Chief Minister said he held talks with Iranian officials in London about the supertanker. Gibraltar arrested the tanker earlier this month on suspicion of carrying Iranian crude oil to Syria in breach of EU sanctions. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says U.S. President Donald Trump is ready to hold talks with Iran without any preconditions. Speaking at a conference in Buenos Aires, he said Tehran needs to come to the table to diffuse tensions between the two countries. Earlier, the U.S. said it shot down an Iranian drone in the Strait of Hormuz. Tensions between Iran and the U.S. increased after Washington's unilateral withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear accord. In another development, amid rising tensions in the Gulf, the U.S. has announced it is deploying forces to Saudi Arabia. The Pentagon says more than 500 troops, warplanes and missiles are headed to an air base in the kingdom. The Saudi Foreign Ministry says the deployment is part of increased cooperation in defense, regional security and stability. Meanwhile, the Pentagon has awarded a $1.5 billion contract to Lockheed Martin to build air defense systems for Saudi Arabia. The U.S. has offered $7 million to find a senior Hezbollah operative. Salman Rauf Salman is accused of masterminding the 1994 attack on a Jewish center in Argentina's capital, Buenos Aires. The attack claimed 85 lives. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the United States has also imposed sanctions on Hezbollah figure. Pompeo is on a state visit to Argentina to commemorate the attack. The sanction will freeze any assets of Salman in the U.S. and prohibits American citizens from dealing with him. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has rejected North Korean complaints against military drills with South Korea. This comes after Pyongyang said Washington is breaching the agreement between their leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump. Pompeo says the military exercises are in line with the international norms. Earlier this week, North Korea's foreign ministry said Trump had reaffirmed joint exercises would be halted. It claims the U.S. decision to forge ahead with South Korea was clearly a breach. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has flown to the United States on a 3-day official visit. This is the first top-level engagement between the two countries since he assumed office last August. The Prime Minister is scheduled to meet President Donald Trump at the White House on Monday to discuss bilateral ties and regional issues. He will meet congressional and corporate leaders as well as members of Pakistani diaspora. During his visit, Khan will highlight Pakistan's policy of seeking a peaceful neighborhood through the negotiated settlements of disputes. Polling is underway in Pakistan's northwestern tribal districts for the first time since they merged last year with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. The Election Commission of Pakistan says 2.8 million people are eligible to vote for 16 provincial assembly seats. Voters will choose between 285 candidates fielded by the mainstream political parties. Nearly 2,000 polling stations have been established to allow voting in the 7 tribal districts. Ten ISIS militants have been killed in Iraq after a US-led airstrike struck the northern province of Nineveh. Iraq's military spokesman says coalition aircraft attacked an ISIS position in the desert at Al-Baj near the Syrian border. He said 4 other militants were wounded in the military operation. The US-led coalition has carried out several anti-ISIS operations in northern Iraq in recent weeks. Meanwhile, a Turkish soldier has been killed and 6 others wounded in clashes with Kurdish militants in northern Iraq. Turkey's defense ministry says 2 Kurdish militants were killed in airstrikes in a separate operation. Ankara has intensified actions in the Kurdistan region since the Turkish diplomat was killed in Erbil. The latest campaign includes artillery fire and ground operations. The Saudi-led coalition says it has launched a military operation against Houthi rebel positions in Yemen's capital. Spokesperson Turki al-Maliki says coalition forces have hit 5 air defense positions in Sana'a. They are also targeting storage sites for ballistic missiles often fired at Saudi Arabia by the Houthi militia. Meanwhile, 5 government soldiers have been killed in an attack in southern Abyan province. An official says the attacker destroyed 2 armored vehicles with rocket-propelled grenades. Earlier, 5 Houthi rebels and 3 government soldiers were killed during clashes in the port city of Hodeidah. A government forces spokesperson says the fighting erupted after Houthi militia attacked areas under the government control. The violence comes 4 days after the warring sides resumed negotiations to implement a ceasefire in Hodeidah. Saudi Arabia says it paid $4 billion to the UN in aid for neighboring Yemen this year. This comes after the UN called out Saudi Arabia and the UAE for paying less than pledged to a humanitarian appeal for the country. The Saudi UN ambassador Abdullah al-Muallimi says that kingdom gave more money than other donors. He says Saudi Arabia has sent aid worth $15 billion since the start of the conflict.
This year alone, which you are referring to, we had paid more money into Yemen than any of the donors in the world.
Saudi Arabia intervened in Yemen in 2015 in a bid to restore the government overthrown by the Iran-aligned Houthi movement. Now moving on, Israeli forces have wounded more than 100 Palestinians during weekly protests along the Gaza border. A journalist is also among the wounded. Palestine's health ministry says troops fired live ammunition and rubber bullets to disperse the crowds. The demonstrations were calling on Israel to lift its blockade of Gaza Strip. Officials say over 300 Palestinians have been killed since the start of weekly protests last year. Four government soldiers were killed when rebels launched a rocket attack on their military post in southern Idlib. The attack comes after the rebel coalition claimed Moscow deployed special forces in Syria to aid government forces. Meanwhile, Russian airstrikes have killed the commander of the Al-Sham rebel group in northern Latakia. With the latest casualties, the death toll has risen to over 2,500 since the recent escalation began in April. In Nigeria, 11 Boko Haram militants and 5 government soldiers have been killed in a firefight in northeastern Borno state. 2 senior army officers are among the dead. The military says a number of wanted terrorists were captured by the troops. It says a combing operation has begun in the area to capture fleeing militants. This comes hours after a military chief in the northeast warned terrorists to disarm or face destruction. 10 people have been killed in a gas plant explosion in China's central Henan province. Another 19 are critically injured and 5 others are missing after the blast. Police say the shockwave shattered windows 2 miles away and blew off doors inside the buildings. The wounded were sent to nearby hospitals for immediate treatment, and rescue workers are searching for missing people. All the factory's production units have been shut down following the accident. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Stay tuned with Indus. Welcome back. Ukraine is heading to snap polls tomorrow to elect lawmakers after President Volodymyr Zelensky dissolved parliament in May. The Central Election Commission has registered 25,000 nominees from 22 political parties. Opinion polls show President Zelensky's Servant of the People party is leading with 52%. The main opposition, For Life party, is second in the polls on 11%. The polls will not be held in the Russian-annexed Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, which is currently under the control of the pro-Russian rebels. German Chancellor Angela Merkel says Britain would remain a partner even if it is no longer a member of the EU in future. Merkel says work with next British Prime Minister will depend on his approach to the European Commission. Speaking at her annual summer news conference, she dismissed concerns surrounding her health. Criticizing the US president, Merkel said Donald Trump's tweets go against American values and what makes it great. She expressed solidarity with the Democratic Congresswomen targeted by President Trump in racist tweets. She says America's strength lies in the contribution of different nationalities. Merkel asserted she was fit to carry on as Chancellor after several episodes of trembling. She said a weaker European economy gives Germany the motivation to stimulate its domestic economy. She blamed uncertainty in global trade for the economic slowdown. Kosovo's Prime Minister Ramush Haradinaj has resigned after a war crime court in The Hague named him as a suspect. Haradinaj says he stepped down to preserve the honor of his country. He was a wartime commander of the Kosovo Liberation Army. The special tribunal was set up in 2015 to try Kosovo Liberation Army fighters for war crimes. "400,000 people have been forced from their homes in Bangladesh's flood-affected areas after 4 rivers burst their banks. Heavy rains and overflowing rivers have swamped 23 districts in Bangladesh. 59 people have died in the country's worst floods this week. Rescue workers say the government has opened nearly 1,000 temporary shelters for flood victims. The top Dutch court has upheld a ruling holding the Netherlands partially responsible for 350 deaths in Bosnia's Srebrenica massacre. The court reduced the state's responsibility for paying compensation to victims' families from 30 to 10%. The Mothers of Srebrenica, a group representing 6,000 survivors, has sought compensation from the United Nations and the Dutch government. 8,000 Muslim men were killed by Bosnian Serb forces in the town of Srebrenica in 1995. China says Australia must not interfere in Beijing's detention of writer Yang Hanjun. This comes after the Australian Foreign Ministry called for Yang's immediate release. China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Gang Shuang says Yang was suspected of criminal activity endangering state security. Shuang says compulsory measures will be taken to proceed with Yang's trial. Yang was detained by China in January amid growing tensions between Australia and its largest trading partner. Extreme hot weather has started to hit most of the US and Canada, with temperatures set to peak over the weekend. The heat wave could affect around 200 million people in major cities including New York, Washington and Boston. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio has declared a local emergency due to the extreme heat in the city. In Canada, heat warnings have been issued for parts of Quebec, Ontario and Nova Scotia, with temperatures rising to 45 Celsius. Experts have linked the frequent heat waves in the recent years to global warming. The World Met Organization says the world experienced the hottest June on record this year.
Both land and sea surface temperatures were the highest on record. 9 of the 10 warmest Junes have occurred since 2010. A heat wave that intense, so we're talking about the June event in Europe, is occurring at least 10 times more frequently today than a century ago because of climate change.
Thousands of activists gathered in Berlin calling for action to combat climate change. Swedish teen climate activist Greta Thunberg joined the protesters, telling them time is running out to save the planet. More in this report.
The demonstration was one of the climate activists' weekly worldwide protests. Addressing the crowds, Thunberg said she would never give up to raise her voice against inaction on climate change.
We continue even if it's holiday, because the climate crisis doesn't just stop because we go on holiday. So we continue.
Thunberg said world powers should act against the man-made crisis to save future generations.
You always feel like you are not doing enough, but we are doing more than we can. We are not the ones who are not doing enough. It is the people in power, the politicians, the business leaders and the media who are not doing enough. And they are the ones who should feel responsibility.
The worldwide student strike protest against climate change started in August 2018, when Thunberg began protesting outside the Swedish parliament. She has since been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize.
The world's longest electric vehicle trip has come to an end in New Zealand. Dutch adventurer Wiebe Wacker completed the journey after a 3-year drive.
To prove this, Wiebe Wacker drove his retrofitted station wagon, Blue Bandit, across more than 30 countries. He set off from the Netherlands in March 2016 and completed an epic 101,000 kilometers journey.
So I wanted to do my bit to promote this technology and show that sustainable mobility is a viable way of transport. So I wanted to really do something that really speaks to the imagination, which is driving an electric car from Amsterdam to literally the other side of the world to show that it can be done.
Wacker's 3-year trip was funded by public donations from around the world. During the drive, people also offered Wacker food, a place to sleep and electricity to charge the vehicle.
In my original plan, I used the IKEA map to plan my trip, and New Zealand was not on there. So that's how I ended up in Australia. And when I finished there were some local people, some Kiwis who I think were a bit offended that I was I'm traveling to the other side of the world and then stopping in Sydney.
Throughout the journey, Wacker regularly updated his blog and social media with updates about his experiences and progress. He says the electric vehicle can travel 200 kilometers just a single charge.
Now the weather situation from around the globe. That's all for now. For further updates, stay tuned to Indus News.